Hello and welcome back to Regenesis Sanctuary. Last time we made this restaurant that I'm still very happy with, and today we were supposed to finish the rest of the interior of this building, the other half of it. However, I just kind of didn't feel like doing that. The last couple of weeks when I've been playing Planet Zoo have been spent on building this building and the interior of it, and I really want to build something for actual animals again. So we're gonna start on the first themed area of this zoo. I want to divide this zoo up in parts divided by continent, and today we're going to start on Asia. Now there's a lot of endangered species in Asia, so I've divided that area up even further into a more temperate area, a more jungle themed area, and a mountainous area. Today we're going to get started on the temperate area. I have at least 5 animals in mind for this area, and I might expand that to 6 depending on how things go. For each of these animals, I've mapped out the necessary area they need for their habitat, and with that I can puzzle how I want this area to come together. But today we're going to start with the Komodo dragon. I've started building the habitat with the shelter building in the center of it. I also want visitors to be able to come inside and watch the Komodo dragons from inside as well. So I added a path that goes towards the building. Now this shelter building is divided into 3 separate areas, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But each of these areas need an entrance to the outside as well. I added some glass barriers for the inside here, but I'll be using null barriers for the rest of the habitat. The Komodo dragon only lives on one island in Indonesia called Flores, and I wanted the habitat to be inspired by this island. So I'm going to be using some of the architecture that you find there, mainly these buildings with the thatched roofs, which you can find in more rural villages. I think this is a little more fitting for the area than the giant elaborate temples that you also find in Indonesia. As I said, I wanted a thatched roof, and the game actually has these specifically Indonesian thatched roof pieces as well, so that's very convenient, and the color of them is actually really accurate, so that's great. However, it was still kind of fiddly because the roofs of the buildings that you see on this island have thatch on the 4 sides, and these pieces don't really accommodate that. However, using the African mud pole technique with the rotating pieces, I managed to make it work. I made 3 rows using these half circles made from the thatch pieces, and then cleaned up the holes and edges a bit. Lastly, I cleaned off the edges using a bit of roof trim. Now, the roof is mostly finished, however it's just going to be in the way, so for most of the rest of this video I'm just going to leave the roof hanging up in the air. To add a bit more detail to the walls of the building, I added these logs around the door frames and also around the upper and lower edge of the walls. They're not aligned all that cleanly, but that was kind of on purpose to give it more of a natural look. After looking at some more pictures of the original buildings, I realized that most of them are made from wood and not plaster, so I changed out the plaster for some stained wood and colored it in a bit more of an accurate color. Later I also discovered these bamboo panels and decided to stick those all over the walls, because that looked even more realistic. But the stained wood makes a perfect background for them. Then it was time to take some mesh and divide the habitat up. I want this habitat to be divided in 3 equal pieces, both including an inside and outside area. Now the reason for this is that in real life, Komodo dragons are kind of solitary species and they're usually kept separate. If multiple animals are kept in the same zoo, they are usually separated by a mesh or glass fence so that they can actually see each other, but they won't attack. This is a good way to keep them interested, but keep them safe at the same time. Even though Komodo dragons do not have a water requirement in the game, it is still good to give them a bit of water. Reptiles are dependent on their surroundings to keep their temperature in the right range, and they use water often to cool down. So I'm making sure that each separation of the habitat has a bit of water. Now it's time to design some fences. I want 2 different types of fences, one that the visitors can look through and one that is not for the viewing area that you can't look through. Because there's paths along all 4 sides of this habitat, it just would look a little bit odd if the visitors were just spread out equally along the entire length of the habitat. The fence from the viewing area I'm keeping relatively simple. I'm using these bamboo poles to just make a simple fence. I am putting the bamboo poles in a bit of different angles for a bit more of an organic look. Then I'm using the bamboo paneling to fill up the bottom part of the fence so that is closed off. I'm making this piece of 4 meters first, so I can then just copy it over to where I want the pieces to go. Then I want to do the same thing for the fence that's closed off. It's actually more of a wall. I start off by using these oceanic rock, like lava rock walls and recoloring them a bit more gray, so it's a bit less lava rock, because I don't feel that makes a lot of sense. Now if you look at pictures of the villages on the island that the Komodo dragons live, you see that there's a lot of height differences within the village that have been separated by these little rock walls. Now I kind of wanted to recreate that here because it fits well with the style. After deciding I wanted a bit of a rock wall, I was kind of lost on what else I wanted, so I just experimented a bunch. And I ended up with this design where I put a little thatch roof topper on top of the wall, and then I put some Indonesian ornaments on the wall for decoration. I did end up muting the colors a bit because it was very bright to begin with, and I think the muted colors just work a little bit better. After both the fence designs were done, it was time to puzzle with them a little around the perimeter of the habitat. One side of the habitat is facing the plaza that is part of the entrance area, and I do want visitors to be able to see the Komodo dragons from this side as well. So I'm making 2 viewing areas over here that are sticking into the habitat just a little bit. Now as you can see, I'm building a little bit further away than the limit I gave myself at the start, and this is to ensure that they will still have the minimum amount of space necessary, but I don't have to make a completely square habitat. Because if all the habitats I'm building are gonna be just a square, it's not gonna look very good. At the front of the habitat, I have these 2 grass patches between the main path and the habitat that create a bit of an empty space. So to fill that up a bit, I extended the habitat on both sides of the path, creating a little semicircle that I want to end up making into a little seating area and a proper entrance to the habitat for the visitors. On the side of the habitat opposite the plaza, I just copied the exact same design from the other side so it would be symmetrical. On the back side of the habitat, I created a larger viewing area using the bamboo fences in a larger semicircle. Then I connected it to the 2 sides with a couple of the wall pieces. Finally, I bordered the path going inside of the habitat with some more of the walls and fences to create 2 smaller viewing areas on your way to the shelter. After the complete fence is done, it is time to add in the null barriers along the fence line to create the actual habitat, and finally delete the previous barrier that I created as a guide for building the habitat at first. I put in a small keeper gate and cleaned up the edges a little by moving some bamboo pieces around to make sure that the gate looks as if it's supposed to be there and not just randomly placed on top of a fence. Now that the border of the habitat is completely done, I used some glass panes to divide the shelter up into 3 areas and started working on the inside of the habitat. I started off by turning the grass floor that was in there originally into more of a mixture of soil, rough sand and rock. For this, I did add the Komodo dragons to the habitat already, just so I could see what their exact needs were. I used quite a low percentage on the brush, so you can get more of a mixed effect of the soil types. Then it was time to add the necessary items to the habitat, like some food trays, water places and some enrichment. I made sure all 3 of the separate areas have their own facilities. Now I really wanted to keep the separation in the inside area, however it turns out the hitbox of the Komodo dragons was kind of too big to make proper use of this area and they needed more shelter as well. So in the end I decided to make the space a little bit bigger by removing one of the path pieces, and I removed the barrier so they could use the space more efficiently. This fixed the problem and also created a way for the Komodo dragons to travel between the 3 areas freely. Now even though I said that the Komodo dragons are kept separately in regular zoos and I wanted to imitate that here, they do actually need to travel between these areas freely because the Planet Zoo space requirement is a lot bigger than the real life space requirement. So each of these 3 areas would actually be big enough to house a Komodo dragon, but Planet Zoo does not agree. So these 3 areas combined will give them enough space for the game. Now usually if zoos want to breed Komodo dragons, they would still keep them separately, but just add them together for short periods of time so they could actually breed, after which they would be separated again. The young are also separated from the adults, because they do okay together, but not with the adults present. Now I added quite a bit of rock work to this habitat because it fits the natural habitat of the Komodo dragons, and also rocks are very important for reptiles in general. The sun will heat up the rocks, and the Komodo dragons can warm themselves on the rocks in the sun. I also made a couple of nests for the Komodo dragons, because we want to be breeding them, of course, and this stimulates them to lay eggs. So I made a concrete box of about 1.5 by 2.5 meters that is quite low to the ground for a safe space for the Komodo dragon, and usually that is filled up with deeper soil. In the rest of the habitat there's usually a concrete layer below the soil so the Komodo dragons can't dig very deep, but in order for them to make a nest, they do like deeper soil. So to simulate that, I put some mulch inside of this little box. Then I covered the outside of the box in more rocks for it to look a little more natural in the environment. I added at least one to each of the sections so they could breed in potentially all of them. Usually zoos would rotate the Komodo dragons between the different habitats so they can express their curiosity in a new environment every once in a while. Then I added in even more rock work. Now for the foliage. They can handle quite a bit of foliage according to Planet Zoo, but still not as much as in real life. If you look at pictures of their natural habitat, you see luscious grass fields and forests, and you can't really recreate that with the amount of foliage they'll tolerate in the game. But I did what I could with what I had, so I used mostly these common saltworth bushes that I really like the look of. I also used some drin grass because, as I said, they live in grass fields a lot, so this looked pretty good. I used this before in the African penguin habitat quite a bit. I figured the habitat did also need some trees, and I ended up going with these mangrove trees and put them on the edge of the water. Then I added some scaviola bushes to fill everything up a bit more. Next I moved on to the inside area. I wanted this to be a little more foresty than the outside, so I added some more plants over here. I also discovered these tree ferns that were perfect for both the inside and the outside area, so I ended up using quite a bit of those. Finally, I added some water hyacinth to the water to make that look a bit more realistic as well. With that, the inside of the habitat was mostly done, so it was time to put the roof back on the shelter because it would no longer be in the way. Now the mesh fence was looking a bit weird with nothing bordering it, so I used these wooden poles to make a little edge for it. That looked a lot better. After putting the pathing into the front area, I wanted a little bit of a raised platform that would be a seating area in a little hut. For this I needed to raise the path a little bit, which was a big pain in the ass, but in the end I managed to do it. Next I used these logs to create a frame for the hut, and the bamboo paneling to create a little bit of a half wall that people could still look out of, but would border the hut a little bit. I wanted the roof to be similar to the one from the shelter, but it didn't need to close off all the way, so I just turned it into a V-shaped roof and used these more ornate pieces at the edges, as they are actually inspired by Indonesian architecture, and you see those over there quite a bit. Now at first I made the roof a little bit too wide, so I ended up removing one part, and after that it was perfectly sized. I raised the wood beams until they matched the roof, and then created some more horizontal support beams. Next I added these Indonesian lanterns for some nice lighting, and of course a picnic bench and some flower pots. Finally I finished off the roof with some more trim, as I did for the shelter as well. Time to clean up the empty bits of grass a little bit with some scaviola bushes and some more of the common saltwort bushes. Now by adding this foliage to the border along the habitat, I did actually end up going a little bit over the tolerated amount of foliage for the Komodo dragons, so I had to remove a bit here and there, but in the end I don't think their welfare is affected too much, so I accepted that I was a little bit over the limit. I also added a bunch of the tree ferns around wherever I liked them. I added some pathing to the viewing areas, however this didn't look very good because it didn't connect with the main path very well, so I ended up making a rock floor using these flatter rocks and sinking them below the surface quite a bit. This looked just like it was a viewing platform made from rock, and I quite liked the way this looked. I copied this over for most of the viewing areas. Actually all of them except at the front. In the back there was also quite a bit of space in the viewing area, and so I decided to make this an area for the talk point. I put in one of these talk point benches and recolored it because the bright orange just didn't fit with the theme at all, and I added the actual talk point. Now of course we also needed a board for education, and I think I just want to make it simple on its own standing board with just the education sign. I wanted to use the main wall that I created previously for the fence, so that it would tie together well with the rest of the surroundings. So I placed down a piece of fence and worked from there. It needed to be a little bit higher than the wall, so I put in an extra piece of lava brick underneath it for a bit of extra height. I removed some of the ornament pieces and of course put down an education screen. I put these rooftop edges on the little roof topper for a more finished look, and I slided them inwards a bit so it wouldn't be too wide. Finally, I bordered the sides with some Indonesian stained wood. Now that the education sign is done, I placed a bunch of them around near the viewing areas so the guests could see them easily. I also placed down some donation boxes and recolored them so they wouldn't be this obnoxious bright color of blue. I did end up putting some custom screenshots on the education board, however there's this weird black barrier with a green exclamation mark on it that I can't seem to get rid of. Now it's also the case if I change it for different pictures, so I'm pretty sure it's not because of the picture itself, but I don't know what the problem is, so if anyone knows how to get rid of it, please let me know. For now, I've decided to just accept it. Finally, I added the last bits of foliage and some more rock around to finish it all off. And here's the final habitat, where we walk up to the seating area first. You can see over the entire habitat from here. People can get a great view from both the inside and the outside area, and I've seen the Komodo dragons use a bunch of different aspects from their habitats. The Komodos really like using these scratching poles as enrichment. They also really enjoy the water and run through it fairly often, probably for a quick cool down. And they seem to be getting along fairly well. From here, people can enjoy a little lecture on the Komodo dragons, and the educator can even throw food into the habitat from here. And we even have 2 baby Komodo dragons already. They're a lot smaller than the parents, but they'll grow up fast. And this was it for the Komodo dragon habitats. I hope you enjoyed watching, and that you'll come back next time to continue on with the zoo. Have a very nice day. Goodbye!